to take a journey through Linux and give you the knowledge you need to be a power user. But first, we must ask the question, what is Linux? Well, confusingly, it depends on who you ask. In order to get an idea of what Linux is, we've got to go back in time a bit. In the early 80s, Richard Stallman, then working in the AI lab at MIT, started the GNU project, with the goal of creating an entirely free and open Unix-like operating system. This all started when the lab got a new printer, but the licenses restricted his ability to modify the code. He had hacked earlier printers to electronically send messages to users who printed items when the printing was complete, as well as notifying other users when the printer was free to use. By the early 90s, there was almost enough GNU software to create an entire operating system. However, their kernel, the GNU herd, was not yet complete. Meanwhile, in the early 90s, Linus Torvalds set out on a hobby project to develop a Unix-like kernel known as Linux, and used GNU software such as GNU's C compiler to do it. While a kernel on its own was useless, he ended up including GNU software with the kernel to release an operating system. Later, Richard Stallman's Free Software Foundation sponsored the group Debian to release a GNU/Linux distribution that was completely open for people to use and contribute to. Debian, over the years, grew from a small group of Free Software Foundation hackers to the enormous community that it is today. Due to its popularity, Debian has become the base of countless Linux distributions. Because of how open the software is, anybody can read the source code, modify it, and then redistribute it. Because of this is what we have now. It's kind of a mess. There are so many Linux distributions that a common problem for beginners is, what Linux distribution should I use? While there are a few distros out there that actually include its own software, one of the biggest problems in Linux is how many distros there are, and the fact that a lot of them are the same distribution with new wallpapers and icons, and everything else is the same. Ubuntu was started in the early 2000s and is owned and distributed by Canonical. The base of Ubuntu is Debian, and Ubuntu has become so popular that it has in turn been forked countless times. Forking is a process in which the operating system is used as the base of a new distribution. Ubuntu includes its own desktop environment called Unity, and has recently started distributing phones running a version of Ubuntu. Canonical also contributes bug fixes and other contributions upstream, meaning that they send these changes back to Debian to include in future releases. While Debian releases new versions sporadically, Ubuntu's aim was to capture the stability of Debian but release new versions more frequently. As such, Canonical releases 2 distributions a year, one in April and one in October. The naming convention of Ubuntu is year-month, so the version we'll be working with was released in October of 2015 and is called Ubuntu 15.10. Every 2 years in April, a long-term support version is released, called LTS, which is officially supported for 5 years, while releases in between LTS versions are supported for only 9 months. The next LTS release will be in April of 2016. So to download Ubuntu, we're going to go to ubuntu.com, and when the page loads, we're going to see in the top navigation that there's an option that says desktop. So just click on that because that's the version of Ubuntu we're going to be working with. And then when you get on the overview page, just click download Ubuntu, the big orange button in the main area. And on this page, it's going to give us a few versions. So it's going to prompt us to download the last LTS release, which was released in 2014 in April. If you're going to be running Ubuntu on a server, it makes sense to run long-term support versions because you only need to install a new version like every 5 years. You can install more frequently because there's a new LTS version every 2 years, but with a non-LTS version, there's only official support and bug fixes and whatnot for 9 months. So we're going to go with one of the 9-month cycles here and download the latest stable release, which is Ubuntu 15.10. This was just released maybe 10-15 days ago. And we're going to download 64-bit because that's the processor type we're running. You can either click the download button to download it directly in the browser, or you can click alternative downloads and torrents to view what type of other files you can download. Now, if you're running on a really super fast internet connection, it doesn't really make a difference. The in-browser download is probably going to download just as quickly as a torrent. However, if you don't have an incredible internet connection, a torrent download is going to make a lot of sense. It's going to download a lot quicker than it would in the browser. Now, I've already got my version downloaded. It took about 10-15 minutes, and just because I have really bad internet at the moment. The next thing we're going to do, we're not going to install Ubuntu directly onto our hard drive yet. That's an awful big commitment to make when you don't really, when you're not really as familiar with the system. So what we're going to do is go to virtualbox.org. And this is a piece of software that allows us to create virtualized machines, virtual machines, or a virtual computer, if you want to call it that. This allows us to create different virtual machines and set them up differently, as well as install different operating systems on each one. So when you get to virtualbox.org, there's a gigantic button here that you cannot miss. Click on that, and it's going to take you to the download page for VirtualBox. Now, it offers different packages dependent on different operating systems. This is going to be for the host machine, and to put that in clearer terms, the computer that I'm on right now that we can see is running Windows 10, that is the host machine. So I need to download VirtualBox 5 for Windows hosts, this link right here. If you click that, it's going to start the download. Now, I've already got mine downloaded. And we're going to need these in the next few videos. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Hey guys, thanks for joining me again. Before we actually get into the installation and use of Ubuntu, we are first going to talk about distributions and what exactly that means. So to explain what a distribution is, we're going to load up this image here. And this image presented this way and in the slideshow in the previous video is so large that it's entirely illegible. So we actually have to zoom in quite a bit here. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned Debian and how Debian was one of the first major Linux distributions. Along with Slackware, Red Hat, and OpenSUSE, they are the 4 different types of Linux distributions. And a type is categorized based on the package manager. Now, there are different Linux distributions that are not based on these 4. For instance, Gentoo and Arch Linux. However, we're not going to focus on those at this time. So Debian starts here in the early 90s. And as time goes on, it begins to get forked, which means that other people come along and use the source code base of Debian to create their own Linux distribution. Now, if we look for Ubuntu, it's, I believe, this brown line right here, we'll see how much forking of Ubuntu there's been as well. So here's Ubuntu, and immediately we've got all sorts of forks happening. Now, there are 2 different types of Ubuntu derivatives, and that is officially recognized and not officially recognized. So a few examples of officially recognized Ubuntu distributions are Kubuntu, Ubuntu Studio, and Lubuntu, Xubuntu, and basically Kubuntu is Ubuntu with KDE pre-installed instead of Unity. So Unity is the desktop environment of Ubuntu. And a desktop environment, we're going to go more in depth into desktop environments in a future video. However, to give a little bit of an idea about what it is, we're going to just have a look at some images here. So this is Unity. It's got a panel across the top of the screen with different indicators, a clock, and this is a user menu that you can access user accounts, system settings, etc. On the left-hand side, it's got another panel that acts as a dock. So opened applications and applications that you pin to the dock will appear here. The top button here is to launch the dash. And now the Ubuntu dash is incredible. I absolutely love it. While I don't like much anything else about Ubuntu, the dash is really awesome. So you can actually search for files, programs, etc. And you can even use the Ubuntu dash to find things online. So it's actually a pretty neat concept. Now, Ubuntu has KDE pre-installed, which is a different desktop environment, and so it's going to look and act differently. Now this is KDE 5 Plasma. They call it their desktop environment. So KDE Plasma 5, and obviously you can see the differences. It's got a window list here of open windows. It's got the indicators and time over here, and the main menu right there, which looks like this. Now, the Ubuntu and Ubuntu Studio and others are officially recognized derivatives of Ubuntu, but Linux Mint is not. If we go to linuxmint.com, you'll see that they did in fact develop their own desktop environment called Cinnamon. And Cinnamon, the desktop environment, is absolutely beautiful. It's one of my favorites. If we look for, here we go. Should be able to just click on this. No. Oh, yep, there we go. Okay. So this is Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop environment. It's similar to a classic desktop environment in that it has a panel at the bottom with a main menu and a window list of open windows. Elementary OS is right here. That's another one that I want to talk about. I've used Elementary in the past, and it as well, in very different ways, is very beautiful, very fun to use. The aesthetics alone are just absolutely mind-blowing. They've got the cleanest interface that I've seen. This is a transparent panel at the top with an applications menu, the clock and indicators, and it's got a dock for open windows. Now, aside from this, their own desktop environment, they've also created other software specifically for use with an Elementary OS, such as the Pantheon file manager. And that's one of my favorite file managers, just because it does a lot of different things in a really neat way. Now, with Ubuntu-based distributions, installation is practically the same, with a few exceptions. So feel free to explore the different Linux distributions if you don't think you'll have problems following along when things look a bit different. Now, when I get Ubuntu set up, I'm going to make some configurations and changes and show you guys sort of how to do that stuff, but feel free to, explore the vast ocean of Linux distributions. So in the next video, we're actually going to be installing VirtualBox and Ubuntu, and we're going to be playing around with that a little bit and explaining the installation steps. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Hello world. Thanks for joining me again. Today we're going to be installing VirtualBox and Ubuntu in VirtualBox. So the files that we've downloaded in the first video, one of them is the actual VirtualBox installer, and then we also have the Ubuntu ISO or disk image. So we're going to start by running VirtualBox installer as administrator. Now the installation of this is pretty straightforward. It doesn't really require you to configure anything. So once it comes up, just hit next, 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 yes, and then install. And once this installs, you'll see how we are able to create virtual machines or virtual computers that we can run on our host Windows operating system. And the virtual machines will have their own virtual disk image, which is basically like a hard drive. So we can create that, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So once the installer finishes, we're going to leave that checked because we want to start the VirtualBox immediately. So just hit finish, and it should start up here, right there. So this is a VirtualBox. It's a very clean and simple interface. You've got a menu bar up here, which you'll probably never touch. And then you've also got a toolbar with icons here. So to get started, we're going to hit New to create a new virtual machine. And I'm going to name it Ubuntu. The type is Linux, and the version is going to be, it should default to Ubuntu 64-bit. Which is great because we've got a 64-bit disk image to use. So click Next, and here we're going to allot it a certain amount of our actual RAM to use on the virtual machine. You can set this to whatever you like. Typically, you don't want to go into this orange or pink field because that's going to give you less RAM on your host machine. So I typically like to set it to about half of my total RAM, which is 4096 megabytes, 4 gigabytes. Once you've got this set, just hit next, and we're going to create a virtual disk now. We're going to be using the VDI or VirtualBox disk image format, so just hit next. The difference between dynamically allocated and fixed size is that in a moment we're going to be able to choose a target size for the VirtualBox disk image. With a fixed size, that's always going to be the same. So it's always, if we set it to 20 gigabytes, that's always going to consume exactly 20 gigabytes on our host hard drive as a file. If we dynamically allocate it, what that means is that we can set the target size to 20 gigabytes, but if there's only like 5 gigabytes of actual data on that virtual drive, it's only going to consume that 5 gigabytes on our host drive as a file. So dynamically allocated is always what I use. It just seems better. So hit next, and here is where we are able to choose the target size of the hard drive. So I'm going to choose 20 gigabytes. Hit create, and here is our virtual machine. We have an option to start it right now, which is going to be useless because we haven't yet told it what type of installation media we want to use. So select the VirtualBox in the left-hand menu and hit Settings. When the settings comes up, there's not much we need to really do here. If we go to System, we need to make sure Enable I/O APIC is on. Hardware clock and UTC time should be defaulted as well. If we go to the Processor tab, we see that it's using 1 core of my quad-core processor. Now we can increase this, but I find you get worse performance the more cores you use. So we're not going to do that. Acceleration should always be enabled. If you have trouble with this and you're on Windows 10, you've actually got to do something else. So if I go into Programs and Features by right-clicking on the Start menu icon, and then go to Turn Windows Features On or Off. Now, here's an interesting thing. Hypervisor is a virtualization technology that Windows includes by default. I'm not sure if it's pre-configured to use. If it's checked, that means it is. If it's unchecked, it means it's not. So if you have trouble with setting up a virtual machine, basically what you're going to want to do is, first of all, come in here and make sure this is disabled. So make sure it's unchecked. If it's checked, uncheck it. It's going to prompt you to restart. Once that's configured, you've got to actually go into your BIOS and you've got to enable virtualization technology for your processor. So to boot into the BIOS, you're going to restart your computer normally, and as soon as it comes back on, before you see the Windows logo or anything like that, you're going to repeatedly strike the key. It's normally F10. Your motherboard might have a different key that it uses to get into BIOS. Sometimes it's F2. So just try that, and once you get into the BIOS, follow these images and you should have no trouble at all. So back to the VirtualBox. If we go to display, we're going to see that the video memory is set really low at 12 megabytes. That's not going to really help much. So what we're going to do is put that up all the way to the end, which is 128 megabytes. It should give better performance, and we're going to enable 3D acceleration. 2D acceleration is only available on Windows guest machines, so that's irrelevant at this point. If we come down to the storage item, this is what we need to use to tell the virtual image to load up our Ubuntu ISO. So select the empty disk here, and on the right hand side you'll see this icon here. I've already pre-selected it in a previous run, but what you're going to do is click Choose Virtual Optical Disk File, and then browse to where you saved the ISO. Select it and hit Open. Now this tells the virtual machine that we want to use this ISO to boot off of and to install the system. We don't really need to go through anything else, so just hit OK. And now we can start the virtual machine.